Thank you.
Well, I thought it was worth invoking the spirit of the Daily Mail with the first question.
Please do, yeah.
And asking if you're a whinging, contemptuous and unpatriotic Bramona and why you're trying to subvert the will of the British people.
Marvellous. So I think that the notion, I mean, as a Liberal, I'm used to over the last, whatever it is, 30 years of being a member of the party, of kind of two things. One is sometimes you lose elections and you accept it with good grace. And secondly, you never ever flipping give up. And the thought that somehow there is anything British about rolling over in the face of a narrow defeat is utterly and totally ridiculous. The issue of patriotism is interesting, though, because I think there are many people on what we'll call the centre-left in British politics who are quite squeamish about the whole notion of patriotism. I am not squeamish about patriotism. I am very, very patriotic. What we saw, amongst the reasons the referendum was lost, was because we allowed Leave to own the flag and own patriotism. I don't see how making the country tangibly poorer, less important, less powerful, less relevant in the world is anything other than damaging to your country and therefore an anti-patriotic act. So the Daily Mail are anti-patriots. I'm a patriot. Next one. Yeah.
Sahida Mansour defected this week, which is disappointing, I'm sure. But on the basis that she thought that that we were being undemocratic. Do you think she's missing the point?
I mean, far be it from me to say that that is a fill-in-the-blanks reason for leaving, and there are, should we say, other reasons potentially why she chose to move the Conservatives, because I think she felt there were openings for her. But anyway, we respect her. She's a peculiar character, given that hundreds and hundreds of Tories have joined the Liberal Democrats since the referendum because they thought we were the only party arguing for a pro-business stand. And in a democracy, as I say, you respect the result of an election, but what a peculiar place we'd be if we had to somehow change our opinions just because you narrowly lost. I don't remember post-1975 those people who lost that referendum shutting up. I kind of think they kept on, and they were right to keep on. They've got every right to keep on. And in a democracy, there is never an end point. We are constantly debating issues, big ideas, whatever side of the debate you're on, we should continue pushing them and discussing them and having opinions about them. And if you believe strongly in something, then you should carry on campaigning for it. And I would argue what is undemocratic is to take a vote that narrowly said leave the European Union and pretend that it said pull out of the single market, which was Margaret Thatcher's probably greatest legacy. To pretend that somehow a narrow vote to leave the institution of the EU was a mandate for a hard Brexit that wasn't on the ballot paper, and to decide that somehow severing our ties with all our European neighbours was what people voted for. That is a theft of the result. That is anti-democratic. Yeah.
Hi, Tim. Hi. Is this on? Is this on? Yes.
It is.
Hi, Tim. Good to see you here. Tell me, simply, does Brexit mean Brexit for you, and can you promise that you're not going to push for a second referendum?
Well, if anybody knew what Brexit meant, then Brexit would mean whatever that meant. To me, a rerun of the referendum in June is a stupid thing to do, anti-democratic, and also ever so most likely to be counterproductive. But the point is this. What we had, and it was nobody's fault but the Conservative government, I should say, what we had on the ballot paper at the end of June was a question about the clarity of leaving the European Union versus the absolute absence of clarity as to what we were heading for. So we voted for, narrowly, departure. What we didn't vote for was destination. Go on, you wanted to follow up?
Very quickly.
Yep.
Thank you for coming back to me. We voted to leave the EU. The mandate is there to leave the EU. Now, we're not properly leaving the EU unless we have a completely fresh page, as it were. We need to repeal the 1972 European Communities Act. If we have this single market, if we stay in the single market, we're not out of the EU.
So I think you are possibly guilty of the thing that people who probably agree with you have been accusing the Remain side for the last 40 years, and it's this. People said, from 75 and onwards, I voted for the common market, not to be in the European Union. And the reverse is now the case. There are people, with respect, who are arguing that having voted to leave the European Union, we've also voted to leave the common market. That was not on the ballot paper, and to assume it was, to assume that people voting to leave the EU were also voting to leave Margaret Thatcher's single market is an absolute nonsense, and again, a theft of the result. Go on.
To leave the EU, Tim.
Yeah.
To leave the EU. We cannot fully leave the EU unless we repealed 1972. We simply cannot. We voted
You're asking for poverty, are you?
the EU.
So, I mean, did we vote? And I was told on numerous occasions.
We're still under the European law.
Well, first of all, Daniel Hannan, Boris Johnson and many others at the top of the Leave campaign told us that leaving the European Union would still mean staying in the single market. So let's take them at their word. Now, you may disagree with them, and I disagree with them on many things, just not that. And it takes, to my view, if you are actually going to argue for Britain's interests, staying in the single market, not access to it, because that's a load of baloney. North Korea's got access to the single market. Membership of the single market is a fundamental if you were for fair trade. And it's a really interesting moment, this, because at the point that Margaret Thatcher's single market legacy is trashed by the Tory party, that is the moment the Tory party ceases to be the party of business. It's chosen protectionism and nationalism over liberal free trade and the free market politics that they used to stand for. And my sense is that Theresa May is going to come under pressure. Either she gives in to that absolute severance agenda, or she gives in to the big business and small business community that has otherwise generally supported the Tory party. If you're in business and you are giving so much as a penny to the Tory party now, you are funding your own funeral. And many people are waking up to that day after day after day. That's a choice she's going to have to make. Either the party splits in two, or the party's funding source totally dries up.
You're in dream world.
Fewer than 40% of the electorate voted to leave the EU. That is not a majority, but you accept that was a democratic referendum. In my view, it isn't.
I think the problem is, so you're right. I mean, there's a legitimacy issue here, and I think 37% voted to leave, 34% voted to remain, and everybody else just didn't vote. But I'm sorry, in a democracy, if it's in a simple plurality, then there you proceed on the basis of the majority vote. I think to do otherwise is just to inflame those people who would feel that their votes were being stolen. But the reality is their votes are being stolen by a hard right that is trying to recast a narrow majority for leave as if it was a vote for severance from the whole of the continent of Europe and towards, frankly, a little Englander nationalist agenda that nobody voted for. Because those people are the same people who believe in small government. They're the same people who believe that acting to rescue 400 desperate children in Calais before the camp closes next week, despite the fact they have a legal, never mind moral, entitlement to be in the United Kingdom, that I think somehow that is of no relevance and no importance whatsoever. So they thought that, and it was promoted by many people who should have known better, people like Gisela Stewart and others, who said that voting to leave the European Union was about taking back control. It was about making sure that we were able to open our borders to beyond the European Union. We'd have immigrants from other places coming in, and we'd be able to stand tall on the national stage, when the reality is this appears to have been reinterpreted by the government as an opportunity for us to become a small government, small state, isolated place. Now, I don't think that's what many of the 52% voted for. So that is the anti-democratic situation. Let's just imagine, what would a hard Remain have looked like? So let's say it was a 52-48 vote for Remain. Would we all now be having dual language signs on the streets of Norwich with one sign being in Esperanto? Would we all now be changing the national anthem to Ode for Joy? Would we just be accepting the euro and signing up to Schengen? No, we wouldn't. That would be an absolute flaming outrage, because it would be a balanced result and you would respect the large minority that there were. The idea that you take a narrow majority for leaving the EU and leaving the EU only and reinterpret that for a mission and a mandate to make Britain a tiny, isolated, poorer place, that is an outrage. That is a travesty of democracy. Yeah.
Hi, Tim. Nice to meet you.
And you too.
One of the things that I was thinking about is that we've heard a lot about the broken promises of the Leave side, the 350 million to the NHS and so on. But I'm a climate change student, and I've been following climate policy news an awful lot. And in March, or at least around March, I think, the Department of Energy and Climate Change said they were working on a new plan to deliver climate policies for the UK, and they were going to sign up to the Paris Agreement. And that since has been said, oh no, we're too busy with Brexit, we don't have the time. Now, with the 350 million, that's kind of been dropped almost immediately, but there's a lot of other smaller pledges and policies like that, which have been brought in by this Conservative government, the latest one, which are now being said, oh no, we don't have time for this, we've got lots of other things going on, we're all dealing with the Brexit. You know, how do we hold those other policies to account in the middle of all this Brexit mess?
Yeah, I mean, there's a practical issue, which is that unstitching 41 years of a relationship with the European Union means that there will be a paralysis in government. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, the cost in terms of civil service time is remarkable. I mean, given that one of the reasons or arguments for leaving the European Union was about cutting red tape, we've just about increased it 50-fold by doing what we have done. Having said all that, governments can use big crises like the Brexit negotiations as an excuse. You know, we are at the moment, Liberal Democrats in the process under the leadership of Norman Lamb engaging in a new beverage commission, looking at how we for the 21st century can do what William Beveridge did for the 20th century, redrawing the NHS and the welfare state in a way which is sustainable and affordable and which is ambitious, something that would genuinely make us proud, something to be genuinely patriotic about. And I'm reminded that not just William Beveridge but Rab Butler during the Second World War managed to have enough headspace to first of all draw the blueprint for a welfare state and a national health service, in the case of Rab Butler to draw up a decent education bill and those reforms that followed. So if you can fight and win a war in Europe and decide and do those things at the same time, you can deal with Brexit and still tackle climate change, which frankly, despite all the things we're talking about here, is an even bigger threat to our future than leaving the European Union. There's with a lovely Trudeau shirt on there. Yes, well done.
Thanks very much, Tim. I was just wondering, so why do you think people voted to leave? Because I think a lot of it was not so much like an anti-EU thing, it was more like discontent with the status quo of like people, especially in the north, being kind of a bit unhappy with like the general status quo of things. So why do you think people vote to leave?
Okay.
I didn't, by the way.
I mean, don't worry. I mean, and it would have been, you know, utterly understandable and fine if you did. We are a free society. And I think the... so first of all, I am not going to make the mistake and the anti-democratic mistake that Theresa May is making and assume I know what people meant when they voted leave. Because there's 17 million of them and there were probably about 14 million different reasons. And so, but it strikes me, there are a variety of reasons why people voted to leave. But I'll tell you what I think was the game changer. And that was, you know, I can say this as, you know, I think the only working class leader of a political party in the United Kingdom. It was the working classes in England especially, but especially in the north of England, choosing to vote to leave the European Union. And what I got, and I talked to a lot of people, you know, people in my family, people I grew up with, many of them voted Remain, but many of them, you know, did not. And there was a tipping point, and it was to many of them, it was George Osborne's punishment budget 2 weeks out from the referendum. Because a lot of these people didn't really know at that point how they were going to vote. They were listening. They heard a whole lot of confusing and contradictory facts from both sides, and they had to make a judgment. And George Osborne's punishment budget was essentially a message which said, you better be very careful. If we leave the European Union, your pension, your job, your savings, your foreign holiday, they're massively at risk. They might go. And there's a whole bunch of Britain that thought, I haven't got any of those things. Stuff you. Stuff you. And do you know what? I have some dark sympathy with that. I don't know if you watched Newsnight last night. There was a really interesting piece on Trump voters, and I came away with a lot more sympathy for Trump voters than I started off in the first place. These are people, they know what he's like. They know he's a sexist pig. They know he's racist. They know all these things, but it's not who he is, it's what he's not. It's what he's not. And the sense that the establishment, whatever you decide that may be, has let those people down for many, many years, people living on the breadline, barely able to afford the mortgage or the rent, who feel these people are not for us. We're going to do something to break the system because, and I quote, it can't be any worse than this. The absolute tragedy is that people like Nigel Farage took very skillfully that anger and that emotion, and people who are going to suffer more than anybody else from the consequences of Brexit are the people who enabled it to happen, and that is an absolute tragedy. But the minute we patronise those people and talk down to them and assume that they are racists makes us as bad as those people who won the referendum. That's my take. Yeah.
I left the Labour Party after 20 years in October, but I joined the Lib Dems on Brexit Day because I felt you and your party was the only party that was putting forward a message that said, this isn't where many of us want to be, and do we understand where we are right now? As someone now about to go back onto the doorsteps, but obviously speaking now for the Liberal Democrats, what 3 messages would you say when talking about Brexit we should present to the people that we're talking to on the doorstep?
First of all, since we're on American politics, actually, first of all, thank you and welcome. So secondly, Tip O'Neill, the former Democrat leader in the House of Representatives, once said all politics is local. And what that to me means is that whatever anybody wants to talk about on the doorstep is the most important thing, whether that's Brexit, whether it's grammar schools, it's state of the National Health Service. So we need to have a conversation with people about the things that matter to them. And that's why we've got to be very careful that we don't fall into a kind of nerdy, esoteric conversation on the details of what comes next. I think we've got to focus upon what actually matters to them. And you might remember 15 years ago, 16 years ago, the fuel crisis, the petrol crisis. A staggering moment. People forget all about it. But William Hague was a great parliamentary leader of the Tory party, hugely unpopular in the country, and led them to a terrible defeat in 2001. And yet for 5 minutes in the early autumn of 2000, he overtook the supposedly at that point invincible Tony Blair in the opinion polls, because when people see the price of the petrol pumps going to a point which they feel is unreasonable, they can't afford, suddenly people's opinions change. And I think we're going to find that it's the consequences of being outside the single market, or indeed businesses dropping confidence as a consequence of their fear of going out of the single market, that's going to have that kind of impact on people's daily experiences. So for us, it's going to be a practical thing. Yes, we believe Britain can be better and more outward looking, whether we're in or outside the European Union, than the new kind of effective UKIP-style Tory party wants us to be. But surely, whatever your views, whether you're introverted or outward looking as a country, the belief that the working people of this country, people on low and middle incomes, should have prices that they can afford, and we shouldn't allow ideological obsessiveness to cast us in a situation where the lower income people of this country end up poorer. Those are arguments that I think are much more effective. So we're going to look at basically bread and butter issues and talk about, yes, our standing as a country. We may have voted to leave the European Union. We didn't vote to leave Europe, to throw back the phrases that were used at us during the referendum. And then I think fundamentally, it's about being at the table and being relevant. And we've had a little taste of this since David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party, arguably his first of many massive mistakes that have cost our country dear was leaving, it might seem an odd thing this, but leaving the mainstream Christian Democrat group in Europe and joining, frankly, a bunch of lunatics. And so when he went to European Council meetings, he was at a meeting of two people, of whom he was one. And not with Sarkozy when he was president, and not with Angela Merkel, and not with the mainstream larger Conservative bloc. The problem is, not being at the table is what's cost Britain his last few years. We won't be at the table at all. When big things like Syria, climate change, international trade are talked about, we just won't be there. And if you're not at the party, you don't know what happened at the party, and you're not able to influence what happens afterwards. So it's about influence, it's about making sure that we protect the incomes and the well-being and the cost of living for people lower and middle incomes. And it's also about what kind of country are we? You know, there's a great sense, I think, from the referendum that it's no longer about whether we're in or out of the European Union. It's about a statement of what kind of country we are, outward-looking and decent, or insular and intolerant, and we choose the former. Yeah.
Hi. My question is, in a post-Brexit world, what relevance does the passionately pro-European Liberal Party have?
Well, I guess you could flippantly say, in a post-Scottish independence referendum, what on earth relevance can the Scottish National Party have at all in Scotland, apart from it being a one-party state now? I say that only semi-flippantly. You look back at what happened 2 years ago in Scotland, and by the way, that independence referendum hugely fractured Scottish society. It didn't just represent fractures in Scottish society, it caused them and it has sustained them. And I sit alongside lots of SNP people who are nice people. You know, you'd agree with 85-90% of their manifesto. If you were me, I've not been through it and line checked it, but there and thereabouts. But there is a deep divide because the politics of identity has been imposed on a country that was once liberal, tolerant and peaceful in its politics. And if you unleash the politics of identity, it is very dangerous to put it back in the bag. And as somebody who believes in a united Britain and in a Britain that behaves in a unified and tolerant way, our job is to try and deal with those divisions and try to prevent further divisions and prevent English nationalists doing to our society what Scottish nationalists have done in Scotland. So, you know, being on the wrong side of a referendum can have great benefits for a party that is sticking to its principles on those issues. Having said all of that, I would trade that result on the 23rd of June for almost anything, because I think the damage to, never mind our society, to our children. You know, I kind of hope, and I mean this in a benign way, I hope people like Nigel Farage, I hope people who led the Leave campaign live long enough to have to apologise to their children for what they've done to their future. Yeah.
Leaving the EU. We're not really leaving the EU. I mean, we still have to do business with them. We still have to do business with Russia and China, although we have to be very much on our guard. We have to deal with the rest of the world, really. So we're not actually going to be really leaving. And also, we import £50 billion more goods than they do. We're in credit. So if they sort of say, well, we're not going to deal with you, that's £50 billion worth of goods and services that we import that they don't want. And one of the EU, I don't know, there's so many different types of politicians said, well, if that's the case, it doesn't matter, we'll just have to take the hit. And you go, what? You were actually going to say that you would prefer the business over European businesses not to do business with us? I mean, I don't think, you know, when we leaving the EU is actually leaving the EU as such. We're going to be dealing with every country in the world where we used to deal without restrictions.
Of course.
We used to deal with every country, and in fact, you know, but we can import anybody from Europe, which is, you know, lovely as far as I'm concerned, but why can't we import? So the question is, what's the big deal about leaving the EU? It's not a big deal.
Well, I really hope you're right. I really hope you're right. And the danger is, no, I think there's a difference between pessimism and realism, and there's also a difference between pessimism and seeking to fight for the best deal for your country. You know, if you're about to run headlong off a cliff, it's generally sensible to at least advise those people doing so that it wouldn't be the brightest thing they've ever done. So I think if we leave the European Union, we'll leave the European Union, and the various things we talked about before that come under the aegis of the European Union, so membership of the European Arrest Warrant, for example, being in Erasmus, to give you another example, obviously the single market and freedom of movement, for obvious examples. And then the kind of more nebulous, but possibly even more or just as important issue I was just talking about, which is just simply being at the table. So you are influential when it comes to decisions around the world. Remember, the Paris Climate Change Agreement was at the good level it was because of the caucus that was the European Union that ratcheted it up higher than either the United States or China would have tolerated. So it's that kind of power and influence that matters. Now, those kind of things matter significantly. So, but of course, the point is, yes, we voted to leave the European Union. So that means no commissioners. That means no electing people to the European Parliament. That means not having people going to the European Council, and all the rest of it. Having said that, Norway is not a member of the European Union and yet is a member of the single market. There are a variety of options that are available to us, and if the government actually cared about the British people, and indeed British business, rather than playing to a rather noisy choir that has taken over the Tory party just as momentum has taken over the Labour Party, then they would be acting to make sure we, at the very least, were members of the single market. And so access things single market is not the same as membership of it. If you want to fight red tape, then having to be in a situation where you have to have individual trade deals with 28 countries and dozens more outside is a way of quadrupling, massively multiplying the red tape that there is out there. Different rule book for every single country. If you're going to tie every business in Norwich up in knots, then you be outside the single market. And don't buy the nonsense that just because we import more, it'll all be fine. The fact is we import lots of component parts of our machinery that is manufactured in this country, which is why the low value of the pound has actually massively damaged British manufacturing over the last few weeks and months. You know, we may be a large importer, but the reality is, however big an economy we are, we're smaller than we were in June. We're now below France in terms of scale. And we also find ourselves in a situation where that market on our doorstep that we're currently part of is 500 million people, the 500 million richest people in the world by and large, and severing yourself from it is really not bright and completely opposed to what Margaret Thatcher left this country with under the single market. When you are called out by Roger Helmer of UKIP for having gone too far, and when Margaret Thatcher is made to look like a left-wing liberal in comparison to what this government is doing, there's just possibly room for you to think again.
Right, this is the last question. I'll let Tim
Gender
choose.
balance, there we go, yes.
Good evening. What will the Liberal Democrats do about the position of the EU nationals resident in the UK?
Well, the quick answer to that is simply they must be allowed to stay. And if I tell you, I represent a very rural, fairly monocultural constituency up in the Lake District. And yet one school in my patch, which has got 80 kids at it, 60 of them are from East European background because the nature of employment in the Lake District. And they're a wonderful benefit to our community. And as a consequence of Brexit, before it's even happened, 3 families have already left that school to go back home or elsewhere in Europe, and that's 8 children, which a small school cannot afford. And it gives you a sense that before anything has happened, there is a belief amongst the people of this country who are EU nationals that they are not welcome here. And many people who voted Leave will say, that's not what I meant. As I find out myself in my daily family life, it's not what you said that matters, it's what people hear. And you've got to be incredibly careful about the message you send out. And the reality is, so of course they must be allowed to stay here, and we will massively lose. I mean, universities like the UEA here in Norwich will massively lose from limitations imposed on overseas students. We have 5 of the top 20 universities on planet Earth on this island. It's not an accident that that is the case, and it's not an accident. It's because we have had traditionally a great open access to those universities from other countries. Why would we shoot ourselves in the foot? And why would we also, more importantly, rob ourselves of freedom of movement? People forget that we're talking about British people's freedom of movement, not wanting to be flippant, but there's something like 750,000, mostly elderly, people on the Costa del Sol. Are your hospitals in East Anglia big enough to cope with them all being sent back here? Because if they're not, we need to make sure that we protect the right of EU citizens here now. Please. I think you're going to do that. I mean, I think there's got to be, if you like, an amnesty for people who are already here, and you provide them with a kind of visa which is indefinite leave to remain, effectively.
Tim, thank you very much. I'm aware you've got to get off to the North Norfolk constituency
Off
dinner.
to Norman's Bash.
So I'm sure it won't be as much fun as this. But
I'll do my best.
Thank you for coming and taking questions, and thank you very much to our audience. I think some of you were in the ones we did during the referendum campaign, so it's great to see you all back. And we'll invite you back when Theresa May agrees to come and tell us what Brexit means.
Thanks for having us, all of you guys at the New European. Thanks for everybody who came. Actually, thanks for a relatively small number of people who voted leave who came, because what is fundamentally un-British is the lack of debate. And so I'm saying thank you for being here, because we need that debate, and we need to make sure that when all said and done, we will stand or fall together as a country, whether we're in or out of the European Union. Why is it important that other newspapers, not the European Union, don't try and close down the debate? We've got to carry on talking, otherwise we become not very British. Thank you. Cheers. You too. God bless. Thanks a lot. See you later, guys. Thanks very much. Nice to see you. And thank you. Take care. Cheers, guys. All right. God bless. Feeling all right?